Hello and welcome to Beecraft Live. As most of our regular viewers know, my name's Rodri Powell and I'm a member of the Beecraft team. I'm also the South Wales representative for Beecraft. Tonight's topic is all about global beekeeping. Imagine it's going to be a huge topic, and there's quite a lot of differences in beekeeping style and practices from country to country. Imagine there's varieties in the climate and the agriculture, so we're going to cover quite an expansive topic this evening. And we have three special guests. We've got Anne Harmon from the United States. We've got John from Bees Abroad, who is also an ex-director of Beecraft. And we've got Kevin from France. Most of you will probably know Kevin. He's quite a regular on our panel now as well. So I thought this evening we'd start by exploring how beekeeping varies across the globe. And as usual, if there's any questions while we're talking, you can ask them via our website. Just click on the Ask a Question link beneath when I'm talking now on the website. So let's do some introductions. Starting with yourself, Anne. Would you like to introduce yourself, who you are, where you're from, and what's your beekeeping experience?
Well, Anne Harmon. I live in the mountains in the western part of Virginia on the east coast of the United States. I've been keeping bees for a very long time, since the 1970s, actually. I do write articles for Beecraft and had some in quite recently. I also write articles for Bee Culture here in the US and for Beekeepers Quarterly, which is an international publication. I teach beekeeping classes, and I, with a neighbor, keep some rather interesting bees. We are not into it for a huge honey production. If we get some honey each year, we're quite happy.
Oh, excellent. You've been keeping bees a lot longer than myself then. I started 10, 11 years ago. So yeah, some wealth of experience there. Yourself, John?
Hello there. Yes, I gained an interest in beekeeping as a student at an agricultural college far too many years ago to remember, and kept it as a hobby for many years, and then decided that the time had come when I was offered one of the best jobs going in beekeeping in the UK for Mr. Manley, that I ought to do it for myself. So I spent the next 33 years in my own beekeeping business, which I was fortunate enough to sell, which gave me a little bit of a pension and the opportunity to volunteer to work for Bees Abroad as a project leader. And I spent the last 12 years with my wife working with projects in Kenya.
What sort of projects are you involved with in Kenya? Is it anything in particular? Or?
Yes, all beekeeping project development with village people, on community people, and in the main, it's just stimulating them to realize that there's a potential there that sometimes they're not tapping into. They can bring about foods or nutrition, whichever you like to call it. It also enhances their livelihood because many of the things that they grow in a country like Kenya benefits immensely from pollination, so their crop sizes go up. So there's another food source there, and of course they have income.
And yourself, Kevin? Give it a quick introduction.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. Myself and my wife Amanda, live in southwest France, and we run 13 Bees, which is our business that helps educate, share our passion for beekeeping with French and English-speaking guests. We're really all about trying to turn our 10 years or so of experience into stories, into inspiration for other people. And we have a motto that suggests that if everybody we see just goes away and plants one pot with a pollinator-friendly plant, we'll consider that a win. So what we're trying to do right now is learn from our own experience of British beekeeping and our French beekeeping neighbours, and try to come up with a plan that means we're going to be sustainable in this ever-changing world.
Oh, thank you very much. So we've got beekeepers from 3 continents then, really? Continental Europe, somebody with experience in Africa and America. So it's going to be quite a difference, I think. It's going to be quite difficult to cover everything. So let's get started. First sort of question or topic really is approaches to agriculture. Every country has its own sort of agricultural style. It's developed over the centuries, I suppose, whether that's monocrops or sort of monoculture. Starting with France, what's the sort of approach to agriculture there, and how does that affect the bees?
Sure. Well, France is, compared to the UK anyway, quite a big country, so the climate actually changes across the country. Not to the extent of the USA or Australia, but that means there is no one-size-fits-all approach to agriculture. So what works in the north, for example, doesn't work in the southeast. So Provence's lavender fields down in the southeast of France just wouldn't survive in Brittany, in Nord-Pas-de-Calais, in the north of France. But there are some things that are universal and that seem to impact on bees and beekeeping. And that is that there is a greater propensity for the use of chemicals to control pests and fungus, so fungicides, pesticides here in France, even though they are controlled under exactly the same EU laws as they would be in the UK. We have noted some significant issues, bee mortality, right the way across France. And along with various other contributing factors. I mean, I'll share the bombshell with you now, but official statistics are suggesting that 65% of kept honeybees were lost in the winter 2017 to 2018 here in France. Now that figure needs to come with a tiny pinch of salt, because that's only people that report losses, which is not obviously every hobbyist beekeeper, and certainly probably not every professional beekeeper either. But greater use of those insecticides and pesticides seems to be an issue. They're delaying their ban. So this time last year, they were banned certainly from retail and commercial sale. And the plan was 1st of January 2018, you wouldn't be able to buy any more of those. Entire cabinets in garden centres were going to be locked away, and people couldn't access anything inside it, with big notices explaining that. Come 2018, and the poster's still there, but the date has changed to the 1st of January 2019. So commercial pressures are probably having some sway there in terms of unsold stock, but that's fair enough. Everybody needs to earn a living, but I think as beekeepers we would like some certainty as to where and how we will be able to stop worrying about where our bees forage. Very good friend of ours, just to leave you with an anecdote on that topic, has 35 hives in his apiary, and he's surrounded by sunflower fields, which means in June and July, typically this year, his bees would just be going crazy, because all you can see is sunflowers as far as you can see. He watched his bees as the first sunflowers bloomed, fly out the whole 10 meters to the nearest field, and then turn around and come straight back again. And he watched this behavior over days and days and days, and ended up feeding his bees. Really? Surrounded by nearly 150 hectares of sunflowers. And he went to speak to the farmer and just asked what had gone on. He had a good relationship with him, and he said, "Oh yeah, I've changed what I spray them with this year." Mm. So even his bees wouldn't eat it.
Great.
So it is an issue, and some certainty is going to be required.
So there's definitely strong sort of sources of monoculture there.
Yes, yeah, I mean, absolutely right. In this part of France, to central sort of southwest France, it is sunflowers in the summer, and it's rapeseed either side. Because we get 2, if not 3 crops of rapeseed throughout the course of the year. But in Provence, with the lavender, they have exactly the same issue. They actually put a call out to beekeepers in France to come and bring their colonies to Provence, because something like 3/4 of the world's lavender comes from there, and they are really struggling to pollinate the crops sufficiently to keep up with demand.
Great.
So that's our own small example of monoculture impacting on not just the need of the farmers, but actually also what are the bees going to eat once the lavender goes over and before the lavender is there.
I suppose generally in the United Kingdom, we're quite lucky in that our farming is on a much smaller scale. So even where you have sources of oilseed rape, there's still a massive diversity of forage for the bees. Yeah. What about yourself, Anne? What's the United States like? I realise it's a vast country. We hear stories of bees from north to south. So in general, what's the sort of the agricultural style there? And how does that affect the bees?
Well, would be very difficult to make a general statement because of the great diversity that we have in this country. For example, in the East, it is smaller farms, much more diversified. People could be raising cattle and no crops at all. Whereas next to the cattle, there could be someone with small fields planted in various crops. When you get to the middle part of the country, in the Great Plains area, the forage is usually your oilseed rape. That is grown quite a bit. In the north, it would be clover, and that makes tons of honey that is sold actually worldwide. Then when you get to the far west, you have the 1.3 million acres of almonds. So this means that it is a pollination crop, not so much a honey crop. Yes, we have huge problems with insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, and things called tank mixes, so that the large farmers would be using those in abundance. The small farmers, it depends on their crop, how much they can afford to put into their crop in order to have a profit. So you can't make a complete blanket statement for the whole of the United States. We do have enormous problems with the herbicides, fungicides, miticides, pesticides, and of course, we notice all of the rules and regulations that are occurring in the UK and Europe. And our rules and regulations can be good for the whole country, or they can be also done by individual states, which can make it quite fragmental. You would find a farmer from one particular state being able to use certain pesticides, whereas one step over the border into another state, it could be prohibited. So it makes it extremely difficult to make a comparison between what is going on in the US and say in Europe.
Oh, thank you. Oh, one question I'd like to ask you while I've got an American on the panel. Buckwheat honey. What exactly is it, and what does it taste like? somebody said it was akin to our ivy honey, and I've always wanted to try it, and I just wondered, out of curiosity.
Well, I'll see if I can get you some buckwheat honey at some point. Buckwheat at one time was a widely grown crop, especially in the northeastern part of the US. It fell out of favor as people were no longer using the buckwheat itself, which was turned into flour for cooking. Well, right now there is a little bit grown in areas of some of the states. Beekeepers will sometimes put in a crop of buckwheat as a green manure. That is, it's going to be plowed under to help the soil. Buckwheat grows very rapidly, has a lovely white flower, and you can get 2 or 3 crops even in the colder climates. The honey that it makes is very, very dark. You can hold it up to a light bulb and you can see a very dim light through it. As far as crystallization, no, it's very, very slow to crystallize, months or years. The flavor of it can be described simply by asking some people, have a taste of buckwheat honey, and they'll say, oh, it's the worst taste I've ever had. And you give some to the person standing next to them, and they say, oh, it's rich, it's delicious. So this is true of a number of other honeys in the United States. But buckwheat is the one where you will find strongly opposed to the taste or strongly appreciating the taste.
No, I was curious. I've always wondered. No, thank you very much. And yourself, John?
Well,
You are kind of
That's this. Sorry to interrupt. This is a jar of or plastic pot of French buckwheat honey. It's,
yes.
the French for buckwheat is sarrasin, and it is, as you can see. I would agree with everything you've just said, by the way, and go further and describe it as a bit of an acquired taste, shall we say? But you can see it's still quite dark and liquid where it's liquid at the top there. But we found the version we have, maybe the subspecies they harvest here, because it's used as a green manure here as well. It crystallizes quite quickly. So this is last year, so 2017's, and it's already what, 5/6 crystallized.
Yes, you've only got a liquid up at the top. Ours would last longer than that. I've got some buckwheat honey in the kitchen cupboard, and it is not in as hard crystals as those.
Certainly an interesting honey. Thank you. And yourself, John, I suppose Africa, again, huge continent. What's Kenya like, particularly in terms of its agriculture or its approach to agriculture? And I wonder if you could sort of lead on into the next question and sort of explore the types of equipment that they use in Africa as well.
Yes, sure. Well, it is a big continent, but and even indeed Kenya is a big country. And we had a project up in a county called Laikipia, and they call it a county, but it's actually half the geographical size of Wales.
Really?
So it's a fair old slab of land. And what you find is that they grow what is most suitable for that particular location. And you get this a lot. You get areas where they grow cotton, areas where they grow tea, areas where they grow coffee. And this makes sense to me, because they don't try and push agriculture beyond what it is capable of doing. And this is what has happened. I mean, I have experience back here in the UK. I'm still running 40 odd hives. We've just completed our harvest this year. We've got 2 tons 7. And I find that agriculture here has changed in my lifetime from being agriculture, which was purely pastures or mainly pastures with animals grazing, to arable, to crops, mainly corn, of course, but with a break crop maybe of oilseed or beans, or maybe occasionally borage. And even in the last few years, it's been quite noticeable that the oilseed is not yielding like it used to. So the brassicas have changed. The plant breeders have gone for something which they want, and have probably ignored nectar.
I've noticed that, actually. Yes, yeah, I've noticed.
I was in the store today, and I haven't got one bucket of honey that is going hard yet from oilseed, and yet we were surrounded by it. So agriculture does change in our sort of what we would call Western world, developed world, but it stays rather traditional in Africa, because what they know works, they stick to. And you find little industries being built up around certain locations, such as tea, coffee, and cotton. But they do grow a lot of other crops, which are particularly useful, because you have people here living, we would say on the bread line, but it's usually on the corn line, because it's a maize that there's a stable diet, which is relatively useful to bees. They will get pollen from it, not nectar, but they get pollen. But they grow a lot of things like we would accept as something which we would import: mangoes, avocados, pawpaws, bananas. You see, all these things, if beekeeping can be encouraged, then they've got the honey, they've got the beeswax, but they've also got the addition of a better crop, a bigger crop, and a better quality crop from some of these things. Not forgetting, of course, that we drink gallons of coffee in the Western world, and a coffee crop is dramatically improved by pollination of bees.
Really? Oh.
They don't get a lot of nectar from it, but certainly you'll get more, I call them beans, they call them berries. You certainly get more berries to the bush or to the bough. And in fact, you'll get slightly larger berry as well. So as a cash crop, which is what a lot of them do, grow it for, not for themselves, but to sell it on, if you can just improve your cash crop, and you may only have a plot of land as big as perhaps a tennis court with your coffee beans on, if you can up that by 10%, improving your crop size, you can see how the income is up 10%. So there's a lot to be said for not trying to introduce too many things to them, but just find out what they're doing, what is working, whether it can be replicated somewhere nearby, or whether we can find a little way of tweaking it to improve the beekeeping. Their bees, of course, slightly different. They're much more grumpy than ours here in the UK. But the beekeeping out there, we would try, again, to go along with what they're already doing or improve it a little bit. There's certainly something to be said for the traditional beekeeping, which I don't particularly like, because it's log hives. It's usually high in the trees. It definitely favors only young men beekeeping. Old men climb trees to get to their beehives, fall out and hurt themselves. And culturally, ladies don't climb trees. So we're if we can introduce a slightly lower level of beekeeping, a lower level height-wise, I'm not talking lower level standards, lower level height-wise, in something that is hanging about a meter and a half off the ground, then both genders, all ages, can do the beekeeping. So that's we tend to go down that route, and we tend to look at Well, I was always told the only way you can make money out of beekeeping is not by spending it. You got that one? The only way you can make money out of beekeeping is not by spending it. So you tend always to be looking out there for what is there as a natural resource or availability, and what skills they have, and can we put the two together? Can we help them to build their own hives from materials they have? Can we help them to build their own, make their own protective clothing? They have a lot of skills with the old-fashioned sewing machines. They have a lot of food aid sacks, which are maize. I know they're woven plastics, but you can make bee suits out of them.
I suppose it's the Western culture to buy everything in, isn't it? You know.
Well, yes, but then if as a charity you buy things and give them, do they value them as much as if they made them? Yeah. So there's nothing stopping you making a reasonable bee suit that will help them to do the beekeeping, because sometimes the beekeeping was done in the dark in the old log hide times. They do tell me the men go up the trees with nothing on, except for mud. And I'm still not sure whether they pull my leg or not on that one. I've not tried it. But the bee suit out of a maize sack, I have 2 maize sacks, you can make a decent bee suit. You find an old mosquito net, it's got a piece of netting that will do for the veil. We've even filtered honey in old mosquito nets. And it just shows them that they can do things on a very low level of input, I mean.
Yeah.
So, you know, and we rather like the top bar hive, the Kenyan top bar hive. It works very well. The bees are quite adept at colonizing it. They do seem to have a little more trouble with usually the Langstroth hive. And of course, the Langstroth hive is more expensive. If you do buy them in Nairobi, you can buy 3 top bar hives for the price of a Langstroth. So would you rather have the opportunity of 3 hives being occupied or 1? And the foundation for the African bee is a weeny bit smaller on the cell size. So you can't get foundation.
So the top bar hives are ordered naturally. So
they have to self-build in the frames in a conventional Langstroth. They do work. We know places where they work quite well, but colonization seems to be a problem with them. So it's a different world of beekeeping.
Yeah. Is there a preferred style of hive up there? You know, if you had to say there was a preferred style, but everyone seems to default to the national hive in Britain, don't they?
The top bar tends to be something that a lot of people can make themselves and use. They haven't got capital to buy too many Langstroths, and therefore sometimes you'll find that donors have given them. Now, it's all very well giving people equipment, as the same would be in the UK. But if you don't give them the skills to do the beekeeping, teach them the skills, they're never going to really put them to good use. Sorry, I've rattled on a bit.
No, that's okay. It's interesting. No, thank you. That's brilliant. What about yourself, Anne? In terms of sort of preferred equipment in United States or in your area in particular, is there a particular style of hive that is preferred?
Well, that picture is changing. And we have to also consider the different types of beekeepers. But I just want to add something to what John was saying, because I've worked in 29 countries around the world doing beekeeping, and one of the countries was Kenya. And I found the people there extremely creative and able to do things. I remember working with a group of young men, and they were moaning about no veils. And I said, well, what we're going to look for is mosquito netting. It's everywhere. And their eyes sort of lit up. they needed the idea that there were old mosquito nets around everywhere, and they could take pieces of them and make veils. And being very handy with their hands, they made veils. Well, let's go back to the styles of hives. In the US, I would say Langstroth hives are the king of hives. The commercial people need a hive that is sturdy, strong, not too many individual pieces to handle. The sideline beekeepers who have a smaller number of hives but are using their, making their income from the hives will probably be using Langstroth also. The small-scale backyard beekeepers, now you will find them using Langstroth, but also there is a growing band of beekeepers who want to use top bar hives of varying descriptions and sizes, Warre hives, hives of their own invention that they hope will make the bees happy. I just came back from a week-long conference, and there were many of the stands with their own type of hive, and they were very anxious to tell you why your bees would be very happy in this most peculiar, very, very strange hive. So we're having a, I would call it a weird hive explosion among the small-scale beekeepers, but the main hive would be Langstroth in its very numerous variations.
What sort of materials do they use? Because polystyrene hives seem to be becoming more and more popular now in the UK. You know, everywhere you look, everybody's got a polystyrene hive. Is it the same over in America?
That's not really caught on well here in the US. You can find some, but it had a brief flash of interest, maybe 5-8 years ago, and then just as quickly seemed to disappear. You can still buy them. They're still there. The commercials can't use them. They're entirely too fragile. The sideliners would find them the same. They don't stand up well under, you could say, constant use or the rough use of moving bees for pollination. Then you have the people that do not want their bees exposed to any plastic whatsoever. So the polystyrene hives are just not that popular.
Oh, really? That's an interesting difference, because I've got quite a few polystyrene hives, and I've sort of been comparing them to the wooden alternatives, and the bees tend to develop very well in the spring in the polystyrene hives.
I think our Scandinavian friends are very keen on it because of their hard cold and late hard winters and late springs.
Yeah, and with the climates changing, I suppose, yeah, there's a reason for it. What about yourself, Kevin? I know you're a keen viewer of the Beecraft adverts, aren't you, and seeing the different prices?
I am indeed. It's one of the very few things that we've been able to find and have a bit of a giggle about since our move to France is the price of bees and beehives in the UK. Sorry, guys, but it's a lot cheaper here. It is much cheaper. Our experience actually mirrors the US to a certain extent in terms of how Anna's just outlined it, in that there is there is a dominant type of hive here, most popular, and that's the Dedant hive, which, albeit made by a French family, is now actually homed, housed, and found its origins in the USA, because the family apparently moved to the USA. And the Dedant was designed as a modification on the Langstroth. It's just bigger. In almost every dimension, it's bigger. It's something around 75 to 80,000 bees at its peak during the season, as opposed to 50, 55,000 even in a deep UK national. So it gives you a sense of the scale. It's half again in terms of the colony. And those are popular. They're manufactured quite a bit by an awful lot of suppliers, mostly in support of the commercial market. So that's why they're popular. You can buy them in the garden centres here in France. So they're popular with the hobbyist beekeepers as well. There is an interest in other types of hive and the methodologies of beekeeping that go with, but it's not really shared by the commercial people. They use the Dedants, and indeed there is a commercial Dedant, which is a 12-frame hive, which is an absolute monster. And a full super of those will weigh about 35, 36 kilos. To actually pick the thing up and move it around, you have to have a back like Arnold Schwarzenegger and shoulders to go with. But outside of the commercials, people are trying and using top bar hives, and they are using Warre hives, which obviously Abbé Émile Warre was a Frenchman who published his book. If anybody wants to read it, you can get a copy on Amazon in English, and he spends most of it telling the reader that they're an idiot for not believing every word that he says, and changing their way of beekeeping to what he recommends. But yeah, exactly, yeah, and they're much smaller, and they have a different methodology in that you excuse me, you nadir down instead of supering up. So there are no deep and shallow boxes. All the boxes are the same size. They're 300 millimeters square, and it's all based on observation and his analysis of every other kind of hive that was on the market towards the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. And they're quite popular here as well, and are quite cost effective to keep as well. Although the frames, because they're traditionally a top bar hive, but modern methodology has included frames. And they're like my first beehive. The frames are about this big. They're tiny little doll's house frames, and they're quite popular. And the reason they are still popular is that there's more than anecdotal evidence. There's reported evidence to show that the incidence of varroa mites are much less in colonies kept in Warre hives, because they're not designed for beekeepers. They're designed with the bees in mind, first and foremost, which is one of the biggest issues now being put forward here, that there's the problem with the Dedant, in that it's designed purely for the beekeeper. More honey, more honey, more honey, sweatshop of brood in the brood box. Are we surprised that it becomes a factory for bacteria and mites as much as it does for young bees?
I was lucky I visited a Hungarian beekeeper about 2 years ago, and similar, I'm not sure what sort of style or name of the hives, but they were huge hives, like 12, 15 frames in these things, and monstrous hives. And it makes you think, how do the bees, how are they able to regulate their temperature in such a hive? Because it's quite shallow, even though it's quite long in length. So yeah, it's interesting how the styles vary and develop country to country, isn't it?
Yeah.
Right. One thing sort of we could touch on, I suppose, is the species of bees, and how bee behaviour varies from country to country. We touched upon it briefly. I know, John, you mentioned African bees tend to be a little more feisty. We tend to have a lot of hybrids in Britain. So starting with yourself, Kevin, what's sort of bee behaviour like in terms of bee species out in France?
In France, you can buy retail from breeders hybrid, so buckfast. They're buckfast bred here under license. You, if your focus is on honey production, there are various breeders selling Ligustica bees, but the bees that are most common are naturally occurring are black bees, mellifera mellifera, because we still have a decent population, certainly in our part of France, of wild bee colonies. So even if you buy a specific breed over several seasons, chances are, through mating, that you'll end up with some European black bee genes in there somewhere. And they are a little feistier, not to the extent of the African bees, or Africanized bees, but they're more middle of the road. When beekeepers want to keep bees for pollination, they tend to look to buy carniolan bees here, which are good at surviving the hotter summers, because Eastern Europe, where they're from, is considerably more landlocked, so they're used to the hotter summers. Albeit there's some beekeepers in the south of France believe not quite as used to it as they were led to believe. But certainly in our part of France, carniolans do very well. They grow colonies very quickly, are very docile, hardworking, pretty hardy. They can take a good mixture of the chemicals that agriculture is throwing at them, and they will get through a winter quite well. The only downside of that is if you add strong winter colony to massive work ethic, what you pretty much guarantee is swarming left, right, and centre as soon as the sun comes out in the spring. But that's these things are all a balance, aren't they, in terms of what you would consider. We do know some beekeepers in the Alsace region of France, so northeast France, where it's a bit cooler, that will keep Caucasica bees. The very black bodies with light coloured hairs on them, and those are very, very hardy for mountainous regions. They can take altitude quite comfortably, and there are some experiments going on in the Alp region of France where they are actually trying to move bee colonies to higher altitudes to fight off Asian hornets and varroa mite infestations, because they do struggle where the air is thinner, but Caucasian bees don't.
Mm. What do bees sort of retail at over in France? You know, you said there's a considerable difference between the UK and the French prices.
We bought, during the summer, we requeened a couple of our grumpier hives with French-bred buckfast queens, and they cost us €31 each, mated. They come through the post. You never see a postman run so fast as when he puts that buzzing package into your post box.
Yeah.
A nucleus colony on 5 frames, which usually comes in a wooden travel box, occasionally in polystyrene. Actually, it's the only time we really see polystyrene here is in transport boxes, because it's just too warm and the condensation inside during the summer gets too high. You can get one of those early season for about €175. So 165, probably actually £175, judging by today's exchange rate. And later on in the season, about €140, so £130, something like that.
Quite a difference.
Yeah, big difference throughout the end of the start and the end of the season as well.
What about yourself, in terms of species and behaviour of bees in America? Am I right in thinking there's quite a lot of Africanized bees in the southern states, isn't there?
Yes, there are the African bees. Actually, one of our labs, our bee labs, did some tests with them and said, actually, they really are pure Africans by this time. And there's a band of African bees. If you looked at a map of the United States and drew a band from the east, Florida, all the way through Texas, completely covered with African bees, and going west and up into most of California and the adjoining states of Nevada, Utah, actually above Texas, there's Oklahoma. So it's a fairly wide band of African bees. Then for the rest of the country, yes, we do have a few buckfast. It's not a very common bee in the United States. The New World carniolans developed by Sue Kobe are quite popular. Yes, they build up quickly in the springtime, but the people who are used to working with them find them extremely satisfactory. The commercial people would be working mostly with the Italian bees, and there are a few people using buckfast, but those are mostly sourced from Canada. Some years ago, the genetics of our bees was investigated, and it was found that we have too small a gene pool for our ordinary bees. So permission was given to import semen from overseas. And of course, this was done with quarantines and very, very carefully. Now we have the Russian bees. One of our bee labs went to far eastern Russia. They're near the coast of the Pacific, and brought back some of the queens, isolated them on an island, and proceeded to see how these bees were able to cope with Varroa. That was why the search for something to help with Varroa. So the Russian bees are becoming more and more popular. They're a nice bee. They winter well. They produce honey, and they are Varroa tolerant. The recommendation is that you don't mix too many other kinds of bees in your bee yard with the Russians because of drifting. Your other bees, no matter what they are carrying Varroa, and the Russian bees are tolerant and can survive up to a point, but they can be overwhelmed if you just ignore the recommendations. So at the moment, we are enjoying a mixture. Bee breeding is going on at various places. At the moment, I've got 2 hives of mite maulers and 2 hives of ankle biters. And what a wonderful bee. They are so nice and quiet and productive. And they seem to be doing their job with Varroa.
Oh, that's interesting. Oh. And yourself, John, so one extreme to the other then. I suppose you've got some stories about Africanized bees, quite interesting. Using a Hessian sack suit to try and protect yourself against those.
Well, yes. I mean, I was just reminiscing in my thoughts there about when I was commercially beekeeping in this country. We brought queens in from different parts of the world. In my early days, to build up very quickly, we used to have Australian Caucasians when we were allowed them. They were excellent bees, except for they were very sticky and gummy, and you had to really prize the hive parts when you were working with them. tried Hawaiian bees, New Zealand bees, continental, Scandinavian buckfast. I tried everything to see if anything outperformed what I already had. I was always anxious to know that did I have something that was reasonable, or was there something better in the world? Never really found anything that was more suitable, and I'm a firm believer in getting the best out of whatever bees you've got by the management you give them and the way you look after them. As a livestock person, you can take examples from herdsmen with dairy herds, or shepherds with sheep. You know, the good herdsman, the good shepherd is a person who attends to details with their livestock, and therefore they get the best out of them. But Africa, well, I can wear a different hat there. They're usually scutellata, or Aphis mellifera scutellata, notoriously spiteful, which is perhaps an understatement. There is also you have some Monticola or Monocola. It depends how you want to pronounce it. These are mainly mountain bees. So you've got like Mount Elgon, Mount Kenya, Mount Kilimanjaro. These are bees that will work in as very small colonies, but will work in high altitude. And inevitably, in the foothills of these mountain areas, you'll get a mixture of the two, which are peculiar bees because they remain quite small colonies, but they have the spiteful inheritance. But it's an interest. I mean, over the years, as a colonial country, people have taken other bees there, other queens, other genetic material, and it hasn't survived. So the indigenous bee is the survivor. So it doesn't. There's no point in trying to reinvent the wheel. If nature's given you that, you stick with it and work with it. So it's a sort of bee that will increase its colony size very, very quickly if conditions are right. We touched on agriculture, but we also touched on climate. Nothing happens until you get rains in Africa. And when it does rain, after rains, it blossoms very quickly or blooms very quickly. And as such, the colonists respond very quickly. And it's quite amazing how quickly they will respond, and a crop arrives. And it's just this is something that I had to learn and relearn, as against trying to go out with my own thoughts about UK beekeeping. And I had to become an African beekeeper. Yeah,
because we sort of manage our colonies to be at maximum performance for a very specific time, don't we? So, yeah.
But they do very little. The average beekeeper doesn't do anything other than keep hives and harvest honey. Trying to queen rear with the National Beekeeping Institute in Nairobi it hasn't had much success in trying to rear queens. They just don't take to what we would call queen rearing, and yet colonies can reproduce very quickly and still give crops. So it's got a usefulness there, but they are very spiteful, and if you upset them, not only will you be in trouble, but everybody within half a mile radius will be in trouble, including animals. And of course, there's one or two very interesting articles about the use of bees to protect their farms from elephants. And elephants don't like bees, thick-skinned as they are. But Dr. Lucy King has done a lot of work on that. We've worked with Lucy. And once the elephants knows that there are beehives around the farm, they will not come near that farm. They're going to eat somebody else's farm, because they're usually, the farm's usually now on migratory routes. So there's a lot to be said for the indigenous bees, and just trying to manage them the best you can. It's probably the only time of the day that you would handle bees is late in the afternoon or very early evening, just before dark. because you know if you upset them, they'll soon quieten down because it's got dark. And I have another volunteer project leader who's been working in Tanzania with a group of people there, from a chap from the UK here, and he's using a red light. That's got like a miner's light on his forehead, but it's got a red light, so they can see what they're doing, but the bees don't attack them. So they'd be actually working in the dark, harvesting. But another characteristic, now I've been harvesting with them, is that the bees actually, they sting, of course, but they try to tease you. They bombard your veil. They actually fly into it, and there's a distinct smell of venom in the air. So we think they sort of squirt a little out. Can't prove it, but it definitely smells of sting. And then, of course, you've got other characteristics. They abscond and they migrate, and they're things that they wouldn't necessarily do here. And we do, obviously, because we don't do any queenry, we rely entirely on swarms or parent colonies to colonize. So there's a lot of differences.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, they are honeybees that do a good job, produce you food or nutrition, produce you pollination, produce you wax. So,
in terms of honey yields, then we're coming up to the end of our hangout this evening, but given everything we've discussed, what are the sort of like average honey yields that you tend to get in each of your regions? It depends on the weather and the climate, obviously, but this year in particular, we've had an exceptional year in the UK. I've seen some hives with 9 supers full of honey on them, which is exceptional. What about yourself, John? Starting with yourself, what's sort of the average in Africa and Kenya?
I mean, they tend to work in kilos, which is a bit foreign to me because I'm still a rather old-fashioned. But they'll harvest perhaps 2 or 3 times quickly during a honey flow period, and they may only be harvesting 8, 10, perhaps 12 kilos each time. But it's surprising how that mounts up.
So they do little and often rather than a sort of bulk extraction.
Yes, particularly out of the top bar hives.
Yeah, interesting. What about you?
It's not massive, but of course, the one big advantage if they're working something like a top bar or log hive is you're getting a reasonably good sized wax crop, because you're taking the comb and crushing it and getting the honey and getting the wax. And the wax is something that my wife and I have been working very hard, particularly with the women of the villages, because they can make lip balms and hand creams, soaps, shampoos. All these things will save them money if they haven't got to buy them. But the other thing is that as Europeans, well, we suffer from the sun a lot, but even an African, skin dries out. So lip balms and hand creams and creams of any description are well in demand. And you have in fact got another marketplace, which is what we're interested in, giving them an income.
What about yourself, Kevin, in terms of sort of average honey yields? I know you said there's quite a difference, isn't there, between?
There is, yeah. I'll give you. There's a Facebook group for English-speaking beekeepers here in France, and last week, maybe 10 days ago, there was a gentleman who posted that from his two and a bit hives, he'd harvested 67 kilos of honey. So if you imagine, that's probably 4 supers worth, maybe 5. And that's exceptional. For the last couple of years here in France, 2 supers full of honey per hive would be exceptional. Yields are down massively, commercially and for the hobbyists.
And that's to do with, what we've talked about, climate change, variability in forage.
Yeah.
And what about yourself, Anne? What's the sort of average type of yields American beekeepers tend to collect?
Well, here again, it is highly variable because if we were to remove the commercial beekeepers who are moving their hives for a honey crop and just consider what we would call the small scale beekeepers, people with anywhere from 2 or 3 up to maybe 20 or 30 hives. In a good year, if you got 3 to 4 Langstroth supers from a hive, that would be considered an average crop. In a good year, you could certainly put on 5 or 6. I think it is reduced in some areas. When I first started keeping bees, I could put on 5 supers on a hive and harvest all that honey. Today, I really don't find anyone in the same area being able to harvest more than about 2 or 3. So from a Langstroth medium-sized super, if you got about, say, 15 kilos, that could be good. So again, depending on the area of the country, it does get a bit difficult to say.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, it's our regional variation as well, isn't it? Yeah. Well, we've come to the end of tonight's event. Thank you for everyone that's participated and has been watching. We may try and run another one of these, considering a few different countries in the future as well. So it'll be interesting to bring in sort of the wider global beekeeping community. One last thing, we've got a special hangout on Thursday, the 13th of September as part of Asian Hornet Week, where Kevin will be back to tell us about the terrifying exploits of the Asian hornet he's had this year. And I think you're going to introduce us the Asian hornet muzzle, is it? The version?
Yeah, a couple of bits to show and tell.
Brilliant. So, yeah, please join us on Thursday, the 13th of September for our Asian Hornet special. And thank you very much for watching this evening. So, bye.
Bye now.
Bye.